afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah Davis, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Women's History Project. Before we begin, we're all coming together from across Canada, and we should take a minute to pause to recognize the land we live on and work on and enjoy. I'm coming from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe. Please let us know where you are in the chat. The Women's History Project is a new nonprofit organization, and our ambition is to promote, profile, and showcase women in Canadian history, their role, achievements, and contributions. Much is being written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors, many of them here today. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life, and we would like to add more. We want to celebrate and honor the past, yesterday. We want to engage young people in the study of history using their love of digital media and the stories they can tell. And we want to make history interesting and more relevant and about women's leadership today. Lastly, we want to help shape activists going forward, tomorrow, hoping that they will understand and appreciate how we got here. Today, we are celebrating the Charter of Rights at 40. And today is a particularly happy day for me. In 1982, I was a young woman working in the Prime Minister's office as a youth advisor, while everyone worked on the repatriation of the Constitution. But alas, I was taking a nighttime class on the Introduction to Constitutional Law at Carleton. Those were heady days to be young and to be starting the journey. Over 170 people registered today for today's event, and I honor many of those here who were the champions in the 1970s and the 1980s. Many were my feminist heroes. Many others are unknown to us now, but they were instrumental in the movement. And today we thank you for your good work. I'd like you to take a moment and put your name in the chat and say hello to many of your sisters. And before we begin, I'd like to be able to present to you two important video messages.
Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from my office in Ottawa on the ancestral land of the Algonquin people. And I am so pleased to connect with you from the various territories and communities that you're in today. My name is Marcy Ian. I'm the Minister responsible for women and gender equality and youth. And I'm pleased to join you today to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the landmark document that fundamentally protects the basic rights and freedoms that are essential to keeping Canada a free and democratic society. Throughout history, women have had to fight tooth and nail to just be included equally in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms provisions. Thanks to the relentless efforts of women's advocacy groups, the rights and freedoms in the Charter were equally applied to both males and females. Through their advocacy and Section 15 of the Charter, every individual has a right to equality without discrimination based on race, religion, ethnicity, color, sex, mental, or physical disability or age. When the Charter came into force, I was a 12-year-old girl living with my mom and dad and sister. And I have to say that my parents always tried to ensure that my sister and I felt valued, that we felt empowered. They taught us the importance of not just speaking up for our rights and freedoms, but for those of others as well. Within Canada, we have many examples of the impact we have when women take charge of telling their own stories. With us today, an example of that impact. The Honourable Judy Erola, the first woman to be appointed as Minister responsible for the status of women, who through her significant advocacy successfully fought for the restoration of Section 28 in the Constitution that ensured the rights and freedoms recognized in the Charter apply to both men and women. As the Minister responsible for women and gender equality, I am determined to continue the historic work that the Honourable Judy Erola and others before me have started to advance gender equality in Canada. Although we still have a long way to go in the fight for a fair and equal society in Canada and across the world, it is important that we also continue to highlight and celebrate the many accomplishments along the way. I want to sincerely thank the Women's History Project for taking the time to recognize and celebrate trailblazing Canadian women. This will undoubtedly inspire the next generation as we continue to work together to advance gender equality. Merci beaucoup.
Hello, bonjour. It's a great pleasure to send greetings from my office in Scarborough Rouge Park on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit. This year, we celebrate a seminal moment in Canadian history, the 40th anniversary of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's a model of inclusion that helps define our identity and aspirations. The Charter enshrines in law our fundamental rights and freedoms, the right to vote and use the official language of our choice when dealing with our federal government, the freedom to express ourselves as individuals and to celebrate our differences and our commonalities. But it took another 3 years before those rights and freedoms were joined with the equality rights protection with Section 15. Section 15 truly changed our nation. It ensures that every person in Canada enjoys the right to equal treatment and to equal benefit under the law, no matter their ethnicity, their belief system, how they identify, or who they love. In particular, it has been instrumental in expanding and strengthening women's rights as full and equal participants in the social and economic life of our country. Women have fought and succeeded in significant ways for their right to speak, to participate, and to lead in our society, and this has led to fundamental changes. In the legal profession, we see these successes in the growing equity among law students, lawyers, and judges in our superior courts, among leaders in our provincial and national law associations. These are hard-fought gains and are making our laws and our system of justice more fair, effective, and just for all Canadians. Equality is a journey, and there's more work to do, particularly as we focus on pandemic recovery and rebuilding. More than ever, we must strive to come together as equals and create opportunities for one another. I applaud the work of organizations like the Canadian Research for the Advancement of Women and the National Association of Women and the Law. Through events like this and through the tireless advocacy and actions, you are helping ensure that Canada is a society that accepts the values and differences among people, one that is committed to treating everyone with fairness, justice, and tolerance. This is the vision and the very core of the Charter, and we must work every day to ensure we fulfill its legacy and potential for every Canadian. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
So today we have with us the Honourable Judy Erola. And this is really quite special for me because I've known Judy for at least, 20, 30 years. And it was somebody that, again, in the 1980s, I was, really fond of and I looked up to. Formerly a radio and television broadcaster in Sudbury, Judy pursued a career in politics after the death of her husband. She defeated her NDP opponent in 1980. It was the second attempt as the Liberal candidate for Nickel Belt. Trudeau appointed her as Minister of State for Mines between 80 and 83, and in 1981 became the minister responsible for the status of women. She held that post until 1984. In 1983, she became the Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs. So during that time, she held two portfolios. Following her political career, Judy became president of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association in Canada, a position she held until her retirement in 1998. And she also served on the board of Equal Voice. Mary Eberts, again, I'm a fan. Mary Eberts is a trailblazing lawyer and human rights advocate. She has strengthened equality rights of women and girls under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms through her work with the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women and as the co-founder of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. She was a key figure in the development and regulation of midwifery in Ontario and has served as litigation counsel, often pro bono, to the Native Women's Association of Canada for more than 25 years. On a personal note, just before Christmas, dear friend of mine, Lorna Marsden, I was in her office and she actually gave me one of the original copies of Women in the Constitution, a brief that Mary Eberts wrote in 1980 for the Advisory Council on the Status of Women. And I know she worked closely with her colleagues and other fellow academics at the time, Bev Bain. Kerri A.Froc is another one of our panelists. She is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law, University of New Brunswick. She received her PhD from Queen's University in 2016, and her research interests include sex equality, theories of constitutional interpretation, access to justice, reproductive rights, rights of political representation, and complex rights violations experienced by working women, poor women, and racialized and Indigenous women. Before completing her PhD, Kerri spent 18 years as a lawyer, including 10 years working as the staff lawyer for the Canadian Bar Association. She is a board member of the New Brunswick. She is actually the chair of the National Association of Women in the Law. Before we start our question and answer session, I'm going to ask each of our panelists if they would give their opening remarks. And we'll start with Judy.
Hi. Hello, Deborah. And before I say another word, I want to say thank you so much for organizing this and for all the work you've done to make sure that the history of women is something that we celebrate together. And it is a grand celebration. 40 years. Mary, did you ever think we'd live this long? Anyway, let me begin by saying that I'm so pleased that so many people have joined us today, all sorts of people who were instrumental in the work of restoring, if you like, the Equality Clause. Because historically, the clause had been in there for a while, and then the night of the long knives, which everybody regarded as the night when Quebec was cut out, they also cut out the women. And that was a shock. That was something unbelievable to all of us who were involved at the time, because, as you know, the work had begun way back in the 1960s when Judy LaMarche really badgered the Prime Minister at that time to bring in the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. And that really was the basis for the whole movement, and that culminated in the fight for the Charter. And during that fight for the Charter, it was not a very pleasant period in many ways, because there were a great many disputes over who was saying what. And at the time, it was really difficult because the minister, who was a fervent feminist, I'm going to say that right here now, Lloyd Axworthy was, and always will be a feminist, but he was not every woman's favorite at that time, because he clashed with women over how many constitutional conferences there had to be. I'm summing up a very rowdy period, if you don't mind my saying so. So anyway, the minister asked, or the Prime Minister at the time asked me to take over the portfolio, and my dear friend Monique Béjean said, "Don't touch it with a 10-foot pole, Judy," and I foolishly touched it. And it was just an incredible period, because we thought things were going swimmingly. Everything had done very well. And then came the night of the long knives, when all of a sudden, the day after, when I went into the meeting to celebrate, and the boys, and they were all boys, decided that it was just a great time to celebrate. And it was in many ways. But when I saw what had happened, that Section 28 had made the whole thing not effective. It had literally said, all right, I'm sorry, we've got a notwithstanding clause here, and these boys in the provinces can cut out whenever they want. I think that was because the Royal Commission and most of the work that had gone on prior to the Constitution had been done at the federal level. So many of the provincial premiers had no idea of the power and the might of women. So when we decided to fight, and I told the Prime Minister that I was going to do that, he was not pleased. As was no one else in the cabinet at the moment. I was raining on the parade. And and I told him that we were going to bring the women into the fight, he said, "You're going to do the what, Judy?" It was as though we were bringing mice in to fight the battle, because at that time we were still considered so much a nuisance than anything else, as far as I was concerned. And I said, "No, the women of the country will," and they did. They went on and we had committees and telephones. And don't forget, at the time, we had no mass communication methods. We didn't even have fax machines. The only thing that existed were telephones. So we used all the telephones that existed in my office and in my office at the Status of Women. And Maureen O'Neill, are you there? You reminded me that what I was doing was illegal. And I said, if it is, then doesn't matter. I don't want to be the Status of Women if we don't have any status. There's not much point. So it worked. The premiers and the women in Parliament at the time, few of us, though we were magnificent. There was Pauline Jewett, and there was, of course, Flora MacDonald. Each one of them not only took on their caucuses, but they took on the provincial premiers, with whom many of them were on a first-name basis. We had a hell of a time finding the Premier of Nova Scotia, and I talked to Flora, and she said, "Never mind, Judy, he took my girlfriend out, I'll find him." And she did. And she badgered him into saying, okay, I want back into the Constitution. And that's the kind of war it was. It was incredible. And so one by one, the premiers succumbed, if you like. They had no choice. They had very angry women at their doorstep, and they had never encountered any of that before. So the last one was the Premier of Manitoba, because he was holding out for various reasons, which were principled but didn't make much difference. And at any rate, we finally got them all in, and Mr. Chrétien, who was not a happy camper at the time either, had to go down in the House and announce that we were free and clear, and the notwithstanding clause was gone. So that's briefly the history of what happened the night and the day before the celebration. Did I miss anything, Mary?
Oh, there's too much to tell, even if we had 6 more hours.
I know.
That's a good start. And then I'm going to turn it over now to Mary to continue, and then we'll continue this discussion because we've got a few great questions coming up, and I'm sure questions will be in the chat from participants. Mary, if you would like to kindly.
Well, I'm coming to you from Toronto, the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, but historically it's been the home of the Huron-Wendat and the Seneca and many other Indigenous peoples from all over Canada, and it still is now. Unfortunately, I hate to say it, government reaction to the Equality Rights Guarantee has been disappointing. Section 28 is almost never invoked in government reforms and rarely figures in court decisions. Section 15 did not come into force until 1985, 3 years after the rest of the Charter. The idea was to give governments the chance and the responsibility to review legislation for inconsistency with Section 15 and to do repairs. Governments did very little proactive work during that 3-year period. And it is very fortunate that we had the foresight to develop a first-rate litigation capacity, because we have needed it since then to take many, many issues all the way through the court system to the Supreme Court, and indeed beyond that to international tribunals. Minister Erola pushed for Canada to bring in reforms to discrimination against women in the Indian Act, in existence since before Confederation and under intensifying criticism from the 1960s. However, the 1985 reforms were incomplete and themselves presented substantial new denials of equality to Indian women. Under the new Act, non-Indian women who had acquired status by marrying a status man were better able to pass on Indian status than were many women who had had status at birth. It was necessary to bring many more court challenges to that new Act in search of real equality, and we are not there yet. Even though a new Act with many amendments came fully into effect in 2019, entitling at least 250,000 people to claim Indian status, Canada has so far only registered 20,000. And there are still instances of sex discrimination in the law. Our efforts continue. Women in women's organizations were key to realization of both sections 15 and 28. Our constitutional literacy was high in those days, as we were coming off 2 years of backroom fighting to prevent Canada from handing jurisdiction over divorce back to the provinces, only 10 years after the first Federal Divorce Act had eliminated gaps, conflicts, and unfairness in the provincial divorce laws. Since that time, women's organizations have suffered greatly from a long history of government spending cuts, both to them and also to programs and services for women. While organizations like LEAF have continued a litigation agenda in partnership with civil society groups, many of those groups are struggling to deal with everyday threats to women's well-being, including sexual violence, poverty, and discrimination on the basis of disability and race. A new round of challenges is upon us. Populist governments are using Section 33, the override, to quash equality and other guarantees. In 1981, as Judy has described, women's activism managed to get the override lifted off Section 28, but not off Section 15. In Quebec, Bill 28 forbids the wearing of religious symbols by employees of government, from legislators to teachers. It has resulted in serious harm to minority women, particularly Muslims and Sikhs. Given that the bill uses the override on Section 15, it may be that Section 28 will have to play a major role in the efforts to ensure that protection of the French minority in Canada does not result in discrimination against women and cultural minorities in Quebec. A renewal of broad-based activism on behalf of women's equality rights under the Charter is highly necessary. I am glad to say that it seems to be underway.
Anyway, Mary, thank you very much. That's very, very helpful. Kerri, over to you for your opening remarks.
If I can start, I'd just like to thank Deborah and the rest of the organizers for including me on the panel. I'm going to fangirl a little bit because there's many, many giants of the feminist movement, two of which are panelists with me and some of which are in the audience. But you know, it's hard for me to imagine as a girl from small town Saskatchewan that I would be on such a panel today. And in fact, I remember while I was doing my PhD, I was on a plane and I saw Judy Erola, who was sitting a few rows up, and I was too intimidated to go and talk to her. So I'm very glad to be on a panel with her today. So thank you for that. What I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about the story of Section 28 and why I think it's still important. That was the section that was the subject of my PhD. So I spent about 5 years studying it, toiling in obscurity at the time, but no more, it seems. So the wording of Section 28 was very deliberately chosen and carefully chosen. And it says, notwithstanding anything in this charter, the rights and freedoms referred to in it are guaranteed equally to male and female persons. And if there's one thing that I want you to remember from our discussion today is you have a bunch of male scholars, jurists, and lawyers making a lot of noise about how Section 28 doesn't really mean anything and that we should ignore women's work in crafting it, that we should ignore the history of constitution making and even ignore the text. And I'm here to say that we shouldn't do that. And that would be entirely contrary to the makers of the charter and what the equality rights and sex equality rights was meant to achieve. And as Mary mentioned, one of the reasons why there's such amount of noise that is being made about Section 28 at this moment is due to the fact that we have a lot more governments that are considering the use of the notwithstanding clause. And in particular, the use of the notwithstanding clause has been used in relation to Bill 21, which not only targets but disproportionately affects Muslim women. It very clearly denies Muslim women's equal rights to religious freedom. And Section 28, thankfully, was excluded from the text of Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, quite deliberately so. So everyone agrees that that's the case, but the pundits are arguing that the exclusion of Section 28 doesn't mean that it can necessarily block the notwithstanding clause in relation to women's rights. So when you look at this history and pay attention to what this history does, it's clear that Section 28 is quite extraordinary indeed. It's unique in the Charter and maybe unique in the world because it was a section that was created by women. It wasn't created by government. It was created by ordinary citizens, many of whom called themselves the Ad Hoc Committee of Canadian Women on the Constitution. It was entrenched with very few modifications to the draft wording. I have a photocopy of the little handwritten note. And the reason why it was thought that we needed a equal rights clause is due to the fact that we had cases like Irene Murdoch's case, a farm wife that was denied an equal division of the property that she had toiled on for many years with her husband, but it was in her husband's name. We had cases like Stella Bliss, who was denied employment insurance as a pregnant woman. And the Supreme Court said that it wasn't sex discrimination, it was discrimination against pregnant people. Therefore, under the Canadian Bill of Rights, there's no issue of sex equality there. And we had cases like Lavelle and Bedard, Indigenous women that wanted to challenge the marrying out provisions under the Indian Act, who was both of whom were told by our Supreme Court that because it treated essentially Indigenous women equally badly, that there was nothing that the Canadian Bill of Rights could do about it. So women were very concerned that Section 15 wasn't going to be sufficiently strong enough to overcome not only these narrow interpretations of equality in Canada under the Canadian Bill of Rights, but narrow and problematic interpretations of sex equality under the United States and the US's propensity in their Supreme Court to treat sex discrimination as lesser than other forms of discrimination. So women got together on a shoestring. In about 3 weeks' time, they had a very large conference of about 1,300 women to decide what changes they were going to advocate for. And one of the changes was what became Section 28. So looking at what the text of 28 says, and I don't want to go very much further, we can talk about this in the Q&A, but if you look at the phrase notwithstanding anything, that was chosen to be an absolute guarantee of sex equality, so that the new charter provisions, which are handing over a lot of power to courts, didn't become a new source of women's equality. And it was very intentionally the case that Section 28 was excluded from the notwithstanding clause, as we've talked about. And Minister Erola spoke strongly in the media at the time that when we got Section 28 entrenched and when it wasn't subject to the notwithstanding clause, that meant that governments could not override the guarantee of sex equality in Section 15, nor could they erode women's entitlement to equal rights more generally. So I would argue, just to start answering the question that was asked in the Q&A, that we need Section 28 now, and perhaps we need it more than we ever have. given the muscular use of the notwithstanding clause. So I'll leave it at that, and we can discuss that further in the question and answer period.
Myself, there we go. But thank you very much, Kerri. I do have a number of questions from the floor, and we will get to them in just a moment, but there's a couple of questions that I have for each of the speakers. The first one I'd like to ask Judy is, given that there was many champions, a great many champions and allies who moved the Charter forward, including government officials, women in the media, and women in local community groups, and this is a little bit of a celebration, so you were in cabinet, and there were many nameless supporters. So, what would you say to them, or what could you tell us a little bit more about the real mobilization of women across the country?
I'm delighted that you've asked that question, Deborah, because I've been so sad that the many women in this country, and there were thousands and thousands of them, have never been recognized in that battle. It's always looked upon as just the battle of the few. And there were, I'll grant you, the few had a very important role to play. But if it had not been for those many hundreds, thousands of women who went to the provincial capitals to fight their way through to the provinces, we wouldn't have that notwithstanding clause. And I think this is a case of victory having many, many mothers. We should celebrate. And those women who did all that work know who they are. And I say thank you to them again profoundly on behalf of all of us who benefited from, and all of us, benefited from the Charter.
You raise an interesting point about language rights not superseding other rights. Is there such a thing as a hierarchy of rights in constitutional law? If not, how have courts sought to achieve a balance in considering these potential impacts?
There is no hierarchy of rights in constitutional law. And the problem that affects Bill 21 is a little bit different. As I understand it, those who use the override to protect Bill 21 to wipe out any connection of religious symbols with government are doing it as a protection for the Francophone minority in Canada. The Francophone minority in Canada happens to be the majority in Quebec. And so we are dealing with this sort of cross-boundary problem here. And an important issue raised by Bill 21 is whether the measures that are adopted with all sincerity to protect the Francophone minority in Quebec and to bolster their culture and to get them out from underneath what has been recognized by them and others as many, many years of domination by the Roman Catholic Church in particular, whether those measures can actually turn around and impose discrimination and disadvantage on others who are a minority in Quebec. And so this is a very complicated question. My own view is that there is no hierarchy of rights, and that there has to be an effort to make sure that each right is given its full expression.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Kerri, you were writing your thesis 5 years. You traveled across the country. You spoke to many, many women about issues around the Charter of Rights. Can you tell us a little bit more about them, or can you highlight a couple of things that really stuck out and you decided this is really quite, important? Are there any real stories that jump out at you?
Yeah. And there's many people that I interviewed on, I interviewed Mary and many in the audience. So it's kind of, looking at the interviews, it's kind of like asking who your favorite child was or is, because everyone kind of added a few pieces in the puzzle for me. So maybe I'll talk about some people that aren't here. And one that stuck out for me is interviewing Marlene Pierre, who was the president of the Native Women's Association at the time that I'm interested in, which is the 1981 82 negotiations. And, there was an effort to include Indigenous women in the deliberations that the ad hoc women were having. There was some, miscommunication at the time. I talked to Marlene about some of the issues that arose between Indigenous women at the time and the organizers, and she was really great. She talked to me a lot about some of the background of the Native Women's Association and advocacy from Indigenous women, including Indian Rights for Indian Women, which were the other group who were very focused on getting rid of sexism in the Indian Act, but also getting self-determination for Indigenous peoples. And they were very focused on that. So for me, Marlene really talked to me about, and what came in my own mind is that there was a little bit of talking past one another. And, perhaps in different circumstances, or even if people had a few more years under their belt, it really could have been a force to be reckoned with, to have settler women and Indigenous women kind of make common cause and, fight together. That didn't happen, but that was really interesting to me to see how there was really good intentions on both sides, and it just didn't seem to gel. So that was one of them. Government drafters was another group I found really interesting to talk about, because I had been given the line that everyone didn't think that Section 28 was worth anything. It was thrown in as a sop to women. It was a political gesture. So, really, it's fine that there's nothing that came of it, because it wasn't meant to do anything anyway. And talking to people like Fred Jordan and Roger Tassé, for instance, and even Mary Dawson, they flagged for the politicians that possibly Section 28 meant that violations of sex equality couldn't be justified under Section 1. Section 28 was an absolute right, and they were all in agreement that Section 28 was meant to block Section 33. So, you want to hear from the front lines and people that weren't necessarily aligned with the feminists. I heard it directly from them, what 28's power was and what it was meant to do. So that was also a revelation for me, and they were quite generous with their time. Barry Strayer as well.
Getting back to some of the questions, Mary, could you please elaborate and describe how the efforts to secure 15 and 28, how was going to make any better? And in hindsight, in particular, has the charter matched the ambition?
Well, I think I tried to cover some of that in my introductory remarks, and that is that it was very disappointing to see the sluggish response of governments in the 3 years between the coming into effect of the charter and the coming into effect of Section 15. They were supposed to go and look and find an inequality in legislation and clean it up before 1985. And they didn't. And there has been a huge, huge litigation agenda since then. And many people have had to fight literally for years to address the remaining inequalities in law. And one of the groups that has had a huge amount of work to do is in Indian women under the Indian Act, who were not only not served well by 1985 legislation in many respects, but it added new problems for them. And when you consider that this is a segment of society that is among the poorest and the most disadvantaged in the country, that's a terrible burden to bear. I think I'd like to add to Kerri's observations that we did make an effort in Section 15 to put in language that addressed the terrible problems of the Bedard and Lavelle case, where the Supreme Court of Canada said that the Bill of Rights only dealt with procedural inequalities, so that as long as the law was applied equally to those to whom it was made subject to, were made subject to it, was all right. So, you could have a bad law, and as long as everybody was subject to it, then that would be okay. So we did try to get some stronger language in Section 15, and our major accomplishment, I think, was that there is now a recognition that substantive equality is the goal and substantive inequality is what is forbidden. And that means that you're not just dealing with procedural problems, and you're not just dealing with formal equality, that is, are both men and women mentioned in the legislation the same way, but you're dealing with a situation where the way the law operates has to be productive of equality and against inequality. And that is one of the big battles that's coming forward with Section 28 as well, because there's been a lot of talk in the journals and in the law about Section 28 just being an interpretive provision. And what we're going to have to do with respect to the Bill 21 case is get an opportunity to assert before the Quebec Court of Appeal, as many groups are doing. LEAF is doing that. That Section 28 provides for substantive equality as well, real equality, not just a method of interpreting the law. And I think that when that case eventually goes to the Supreme Court of Canada, we will have to say the same thing there. So there's really a lot more work to do.
Thank you, Mary. A question for all three of you, and it's a question from the floor. How would you prioritize what we have to do going forward? What are the top three things that we could do to help us focus and achieve further gains towards equality? So I'll start with Kerri, then go to Judy, and then go to Mary. What top three things do we have to do to gain real equality?
Well, I can't do any better than talk about Null's strategic plan, because we just went through this exercise of trying to prioritize these areas. So looking at Bill 21 and issues for some of the most marginalized women in Canada is top priority for us. Climate change, pipelines, that's been an issue that seems to have been talked about exclusively in constitutional circles from a federalism perspective. And there's real gender equality issues in that, because as we all know, women are disproportionately affected by climate change. When pipelines are constructed, Indigenous women are women that are harmed from the men camps, as they call them, being in those areas. Something that's close to my heart is getting reproductive rights and reproductive justice freely established in Canada. That's not only with respect to abortion access, which surprisingly in 2022 remains a problem. There's a case that's being fought in New Brunswick about that very issue, but also things like forced sterilization. And I would say the last issue that we still haven't come to terms with is violence against women. I think the constitutional case involving the provision concerning extreme intoxication, and whether that's going to be struck down by the Supreme Court, and whether that will be a defense that men will therefore be able to advance in cases of violence, intimate partner violence. Those would be my top challenges that we have to tackle.
Judy, perhaps taking a look a little bit more on the political side, what are the three top priorities that we should be championing?
One of the things that I really disturbs me is the the sort of fractured response in the country to many of these issues that you have been describing. We can't seem to get together to fight some of the big fights. Mary, you're talking about the women in Quebec, for instance. That's a major concern. Another major concern for me is the issue of Native women and the missing women, and the fact that I see no white faces among the Native women's group fighting the fight along with them. Am I imagining, or have we abandoned these women? That worries me a great deal. So I think we need one organization or place where we can get these issues sharply into focus and get a lot of power behind them. Otherwise, things don't happen.
Thank you. Mary, the top 3 priorities.
Well, they all kind of blend together for me, but I would put my top one is what Judy just mentioned, and that is that we have to develop better relations and understandings among all the various diverse women in the country, and get a way of choosing our priorities that are based on a commonality and respect for minority interests. And in the second wave feminist organizations, try as many did, there was still, I think, a huge problem in reconciling what minority women wanted and what elite white women wanted. And we just really have to deal with that if there is to be any kind of broad sort of social activism behind women's equality. I think it's difficult now because the situation in the women's movement has really put a premium on the somewhat elitist activity of litigation. And, you know, there are so many organizations that team up with LEAF or with West Coast LEAF or with the Asper Center to take their issues to court. And that is not going to achieve broadly based from the bottom up social justice, which is what I think we need. And as far as specific issues are concerned, I think we need to consider in one sort of envelope violence against women and violence against the earth. And the connection between violence against women and violence against the earth is profound. And our Indigenous sisters can teach us a lot about how to deal with it, but it's no mistake, I think, that, you know, a lot of the imagery in Canadian, European literature talks about the earth as the mother and sees the earth as a woman. And the earth and women are both being violated to a hideous extent now. And I think that should be our issue priority.
Thank you. There have been 2 questions from the floor about, is it time to create another organization such as NAC was, the one overarching umbrella organization that lobbied governments, not just federal government, but provincial governments? Is there a need for such that, you know, a big organization like that to really lobby? So we'll start off with Mary, perhaps, then go to Kerri and then Judy.
Well, as I understand NAC, and it's been a while since I've been in NAC, it's been a while since it was functioning. I was once on the board, and it was a sort of an umbrella organization for many, many different organizations. It brought the power of all of them to a fine point to be used to lobby and work for change. And I have my reservations, actually, about that form of organization, because, as I said before, I'm not sure that in any of our second wave feminist organizations, we got the balance right between white privileged women and people who weren't white privileged women. And I'm very keen on the idea of coordinating and developing common understandings and common strategies amongst organizations of women. But I'm not sure that centralizing everything in one organization at the apex is the way to do it. I would like to see more funding and more capacity building for all organizations working on women's issues, and more respectful coordination between them, and a willingness at some points to prioritize issues that are chosen by minorities rather than by a majoritarian consensus among women. That's as far as I get on that issue, I'm afraid.
No, that's very good. Judy?
My point, Mary, is that I don't think that we will see a great deal of change unless there is a need by the political forces to change. In other words, if we're all fractured on various issues, we have no political power to speak of. And where does that power come from? It comes from a group of people who have a lot of political clout at the polls. And somehow, by being as fractured as we are, no one group has any real power. So how do we harness that power and make some priorities? Because certainly there are priorities that I think we should establish.
That's good. Kerri, did you have a thought? And then maybe I'm going to open up the floor to see if any of the panelists have a question of another panelist. So Kerri, do you want to answer that question? Is it time to have another nap?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to be able to go back to the halcyon days of having all of these like really major players. Like I remember, hearing Judy Rebick from NAC, just giving it to the politicians, and I love that. And also the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women, for that matter, the arm's length government funded body that would give it to them behind closed doors. I would love it, but I don't think that you can go back in time and recreate those kinds of conditions where you would have the same kind of impact, and also avoid some of the pitfalls that Mary has talked about. And so I think the way to go forward is core funding for women's groups. That's something that we've tried to press upon government is needed. You can't scrabble together funding, project-based funding. That's not a good basis to allow women's organizations to grow and flourish and to do the good work that they need to do, rather than chasing down paperwork for all of this project funding. We didn't win that battle in this budget, but it's something that every one of you who is listening today can contact their MP and tell them that you support that, and that should be in the next budget.
Should we not be engaged in some programs where we educate women? I think there's a big problem in that today's women have hardly any knowledge of the charter, and have taken much of what exists in the country today for granted. Is there a process of education that is needed at this stage?
I would tell you that's one of the reasons why the Women's History Project wants to exist, is so we can actually talk about the past to make it relevant today. So I would say that to anybody at any time. Good question.
Is there something wrong with the way we educate women these days? Most of them, if you ask most young women under 21 or 21 or so, what does the charter mean to them, they have no knowledge that such a thing exists.
Be it for me to say anything as a moderator, but
and
there would be
women today, young women today.
Judy, you're quite right, but there's a bigger question about civics education, generally speaking. So I think you make a good point, but it's about civics education. It's about how governments work and what governments do and what. So there's a lot of issues. It's not just about women's issues or the Constitution. It's about how governments work. So that's kind of important.
No, I agree. I agree with you, but I think that the issue of women, young women today, who are taking for granted some of the freedoms they enjoy today, and we are about to lose in many ways. I mean, we're talking about reproductive rights, about the issue in Quebec, and it seems to have no relevance to the young women today.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah.
Could I horn in here, I wonder?
Absolutely. Please.
I think that education is a really good idea. And when we started LEAF, we did call it the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. But I think that many of the people who started LEAF thought that there was a little bit too much action, especially in the courts, and too little education. My idea of education would be sort of mutual and continuing, because women like me have no idea what is really bugging women in other generations and in other contexts, in other races, in other areas of the country. I want to learn what is a priority with them and what they wish to see dealt with. And I think that, that is one way of dealing with charter education, because we don't do it in the abstract, but if we have a conversation going between women about what's bugging women, what's oppressing women now, and then discussing how the charter might help that, and not just in the courts, but around people's kitchen tables, out when they're biking and this kind of thing. I think it's really important.
Well, I think also that, I tell my law students that they're in a very privileged position and they should go out and be, good charter ambassadors. But even, to have public conversations about it, young women are very adept at talking on social media about various issues, and we need to have more of that. We need to have more bringing people into the conversation, more talking outside of our bubbles. A few great things that NOL is doing, if you'll excuse the plug, is that we do have modules on feminist law reform. So if you want to lobby for a particular change, you can go and complete the modules and figure out how to write a good op-ed about a women's issue, or how to advocate for a certain legal change with the government of the day. We're also kicking off with an organization called Luke's Place, a national coalition of women's organizations. So, that's a couple of things that are kind of we're putting out there to support and advance constitutional knowledge and knowledge of charter rights. I mean, sometimes constitutional law professors don't even teach Section 15 in first year law, surprisingly. Not to even mention Section 28, goodness knows. All of my students know about it. I will say that.
That's one way to do it, and I think both of these are extremely important. I think, is there any way we can just somehow make it a conversation piece in homes? How young women today even know the subject enough to pass it on to their children? I don't. It's not. I think you've got your work cut out for you, Deborah.
Yeah. As I say, it's not just constitutional law. And it's one of the reasons why we exist, is we're trying to bring some younger people in a younger, more youthful way, the TikTok generation, to try to get them to discover some of the interesting stories about women, about the interesting women that have had fabulous journeys throughout Canadian history, and to make it more relevant and more current. Fabulous books and articles and journals, but how do you engage? So that's one of the things our board grapples with all the time. How do we engage the 25-year-old, the 20-year-old, the 12-year-old? So we
exactly.
Yeah. One of the things everything looks like a nail, I guess, is the problem.
But one of the things I'd like to say here, though, is this is not a one-way conversation. I have many times in my personal life and also my professional life learned things from younger people that have really broadened my perspective. And as issues become more complicated, for example, the sort of gender identity issues, we need to learn from younger people, because this is an issue that was not part of our thinking in a big way when we were developing our approach to equality. And we just
You're right.
keep learning from each other. And I'm pleased that one of the cases that's going through the Asper Center at this time is a test case that's brought by a number of young people under 18 to assert their right to vote. I think that's a very promising development. They know what their charter rights should be or are, and so they're deliberately taking the fight to court. And I think that's great. I mean, they've worked together for 2 or 3 years before getting their paperwork into the courts, and it's going to take a while, but I think it's a fantastic development.
I guess
That's interesting.
Of the olden days of, I remember, reading in Chatelaine and Chatelaine, back in the 80s was a very political magazine. And I see that Linda Silver Dranoff is in the audience. And I remember just voraciously reading her column. I believe it was on family law. And she also did some accessible documents for women on family law. So, I mean, we've got to think about how to operationalize things like, something like that in 2022 so that we can get, women together and discuss about, the issues that are really facing them today. Us in academia are somewhat removed from it, and we need to talk about, the frontline people. That really needs to be, the people that are informing the work.
And, there are so many problems now, not in many provinces. I don't think there's one that deals with this satisfactorily, where women and people of low income are not able to get lawyers to deal with their issues in court. And there are all kinds of efforts made, by the courts and by government websites and so on, kind of to teach people how to represent themselves in court. And I had occasion this past year to read some of those websites, and I couldn't figure them out. And I'm a lawyer. And the governments and the courts expect that lay people are going to be able to take that website and figure out how to bring their case to court. It doesn't work. We need to be more interactive on the issue of, developing a rights consciousness and a legal consciousness among people who actually really desperately need that in order to look after themselves. If there are no lawyers around to help them, then developing people's capacity to help themselves not in the patronizing, jargon-ridden way that those things come out of the governments and the courts, but in a much better way, would be so effective and so worthwhile.
Fabulous idea. There you go for Null. There you go. That's something that Null can take on, is trying to get less jargon and more populist kind of activities available for younger generations. Kerri?
Populist.
Okay, popular. Well, I just had this discussion about populist. Is it right wing, left wing? What does that mean? And I've also just recently had a discussion about 16-year-olds and their right to vote. So that was this week alone with friends of mine who just want to talk about these issues. I'm just going to do one final round before it's 4:15, and I just want to wrap up shortly. But I just want to sort of like have a couple of conclusions. The charter, is it a good thing, a bad thing? Things that were successful, things that failed. What would you tell your younger self? So those kinds of thoughts that you would like to leave with audiences here today. I'll start with Judy, then I'll go to Kerri, and then Mary.
Well, I think we should be celebrating, and there is no question that the Constitution was fundamental to all of us, particularly to women, and it has changed our lives, whether we like it or not. The consequences are going to fall out over the years. I think it's developing still, But the basis, the fundamental law is there to give us that protection that we have the right to go and do the things that have to be done. And I think that should be celebrated. After all, the U.S. women don't have it yet either.
Kerri, over to you.
So your question was about take-home points, basically?
Yeah, take-home points.
Okay. So, as, the women I spoke to during the interviews, they say, we can't believe that, back in the early 80s, the stuff we are fighting for, it's still the same stuff today, this stuff again. So that's the thing about rights. Unless you kind of jealously guard them and fight for them, they disappear. I mean, take a look at what's happening in the United States with reproductive rights. So really, it is something that everyone has to take individual and personal responsibility for, to get out there and make their views known, to advance and protect women's rights. So it's not the case that one person can't make a difference. It's rather cliche. But especially in the year of 2022, you have various means at your disposal to amplify your voice. And Judy was right that it wasn't just a small group of women that fought for 28. It was women across the country being outraged by what the male politicians were doing and coming together and, looking at Alan Blakey on the steps of, the Regina legislature and giving him hell. Yeah. And things like that. So it really is up to every one of us to do our best every day to get some traction and get some gains.
Stand on guard.
Mary.
I'm going to bring an example here of many of us watched a lot of the blockades and the Ottawa occupation on television in late January and through almost all of February. And it was very striking that the people who were parking their big trucks in downtown Ottawa and harassing people and honking their horns all night and using sometimes quite lewd suggestions about take your mask off and this kind of thing. They were really articulating a concept of freedom that does not come from our legal system or our constitution. It comes, it's an extreme version of the United States Constitution, where I hasten to tell you, there is no provision in their constitution which sets a limit like Section 1 on government behavior. And it's up to judges to kind of create those limits on an ad hoc basis. And when people were yelling, I have freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression, they were doing it as if there were no limits to it. And this kind of populist expression of utmost freedom is not going to be healthy for many, many of us in the society. And that is above all other things about charter education. Yes, it's going to be very helpful to us if we become more familiar with our rights in a family law or a tenant context or whatever. It's going to be very good if we have a large group of people who can lobby the government. But really importantly, in those kitchen table conversations, community conversations, and something that goes as big as blockades, we really have to have a really good sense of what our rights are under this Constitution, under the Canadian Constitution, so that this extremely distorted version of American constitutional rights is not an instrument that can be used to run roughshod over all of us.
Really, really good point. I live about 10 blocks away from where that blockade happened. And that's where the whole discussion amongst my friends came up about a civics education, yes, because people really didn't understand what our rights were and how our governments work. They were making outrageous claims. What was really interesting about that blockade, it was actually a very young woman who actually took a case to court.
Yeah.
Oh,
and that
yes,
was
that's fantastic.
yeah. So whoever gets her,
Absolutely fantastic.
so
Yes. Yeah.
whichever political party gets her to run for them will be very successful in whichever riding she bloody well
I
wants.
think she's going to be busy for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was really remarkable. It was a very young woman who just said, "No, we want an injunction on the noise," and she went after it, and she got it. And that just
Yeah.
that
It was an
resonated with me
emperor
because
has no clothes moment. Yeah.
yeah, it
Yes.
was. There was one other question here, Kerri. Could you please expand your comment that Null is proposing a coalition of women's groups? I mean that goes back to the next question. You made mention of it.
Yeah, and I can't say that much more about it because we're going to have an announcement imminently, as I understand. Tiffany Butler is our intrepid executive director, and that's what she advises. So all I can say about that is stay tuned. Take a look at Null's website on social media, and we will be making an announcement short. So always leave them wanting more, I say.
Absolutely. So anything else you want to say to each other or you want to say to our audiences before I start the conclusion?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you for organizing this, and thank you to everyone for participating and for sending us such great questions and comments and information in the chat. I mean, this is so great to be all together again in this way, kind of making trouble. I like it.
Judy, anything? Kerri, anything?
We should have more of this. That's what I say. I'm especially starved for human interaction coming out of the last few years. So it's lovely to talk about things with like-minded people. And as I say, standing on the shoulders of giants here, it's just amazing to see those in the audience and those on the panels. It's been great.
Are we here?
It was. We're still continuing. Anyway, I want to thank our special guests, the Honourable Judy Erola, Mary Eberts, and Kerri Froc for participating this afternoon. It's been a fabulous discussion. I'd also like to extend thanks to participants. Your attendance and participation are heartwarming. And to those of you who kindly made a donation, thank you. I'd also like to thank our partners, Experiences Canada, for hosting this webinar, to the National Association of Women in the Law, and to Jackie Neopol and the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women. Korea and the Women's History Project have a memorandum of understanding so that they will actually issue tax receipts on our behalf as we grow our organization. We are less than 6 months old with our incorporation. We've been doing this for about 12 months. The expectation is that we will have 5 events a year around different types of topics to engage people, but use those themes to then try to do some more things with videos and outreach. So we're still trying to develop our strategic plan for our new organization. And in fact, we are developing a business case to create a women's history production fund so that we can engage young people by offering small grants so that they can explore the role of women played in history and in life and bring more history to digital productions, thinking that that will attract more youthful audiences in a much more creative way. Finally, I'd like to thank our board for their energy, their time, their enthusiasm. And when we talk about young people, I want to really thank we have about 5 or 6 young women who are volunteers who handle all our communications. They're in their mid-20s. So they do our communications, social media, and our technical support. They help me on the website. And today I'd like to thank Clara and Catherine for managing our technical support. Our next event will be held on June 20th. We will be having a special 2-hour virtual Indigenous Women's Circle honoring the Indigenous women leaders and storytellers in advance of National Aboriginal Day. I hope you will join us. And I would like to extend again a huge thank you to our panelists, to the participants, to our funders, and to our supporters and our the people that sort of like drive us all on. So thank you very much.